Hello friends, welcome to Folk Beats. I'm your host Aimon Fatima. Friends, we often talk about folk musicians and folk music, but have you ever wondered what folk itself is? What folk traditions are? We talked about shared narratives, rituals, celebrations, and festivals, but we never took time to understand why it's so important for human existence. Today, we invited someone in our studios who specializes in folklore, and folk traditions. Dr. Frank J Korom. He's a professor of religion and anthropology at Boston University. Welcome to our studios.
Thank you for your invitation.
Dr. Frank, you especially came to Pakistan, and we got to know that you have a special interest in South Asia and Pakistani and Indian Bengali traditions.
Yes.
So how about you start from telling us about your work?
All right. Well, I've had a long-standing fascination with South Asia ever since I was a child. I was very interested in the region, and then I traveled here unofficially, that is non-academically, when I was a teenager. I went from Europe overland to India, crossed through Pakistan and Afghanistan on the way. And then when I went back, I decided to go to university and study South Asia from an academic perspective. So I started learning languages, first Hindi, then Urdu. I came to Pakistan in 1984, 85, and I lived in Lahore, where I was studying Urdu and a little Punjabi also. Then I came back and did my doctoral research in West Bengal, India. And ever since then, I've been coming back and forth on different projects. I've done research in India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and most recently in Sri Lanka. So I'm coming back here now after 32 years. So I'm really happy to be back.
Okay, and recently we attended a lecture where you talked about folklore and its position in international perspective. What is folk?
Folk is one of those terms that really is difficult to define. People often say, I know it when I see it, but it's hard to put into words. Because it's one of those things that's kind of ineffable. We experience it all the time, but it's difficult to pinpoint it and put your finger on it. So, older definitions of the folk used to separate the folk out from the intellectuals or the urban, cosmopolitan, educated class. They were perceived to be the peasantry, the backward, non-literate people who sang and danced and didn't have access to the outside world. That's a kind of romanticized notion that was created in the 19th century by European nationalists. But more recently, since 1970s, we've come up with a more sophisticated understanding which emphasizes the communicative dimension of folklore. So the folk can be defined as Alan Dundes, the famous folklorist and anthropologist, the late and great Alan Dundes from the University of California, Berkeley, said, folk can be any group of people that share something in common. So it can be a passion for sport, it can be a passion for art, or it can be anything that you share, cooking, or your family. There's family lore, or occupational lore. Lawyers have their own form of folklore. Hunters have their own form of folklore. Cricket players have their own form of folklore, and the list goes on and on. So you can be a member of more than one folk group simultaneously. You can be a cigar-smoking cricket player hunter and belong to all of these different folk groups simultaneously. So folk is simply a designation. It's kind of arbitrary. It's simply a designation to say something that brings people together for a common purpose.
Okay, and folklore or folk itself, is this, you said these are shared narratives, so they are mostly tangible or intangible?
Yes.
Or they can be any form? Does it have to be a fact, or people can make up stories? Because this is a very common question, folklore, myth,
is it true or false?
Yeah.
That's a good question, actually. So folk refers to the people and lore refers to the narratives. But folklore is a little bit narrow in the sense that it only focuses on the verbal dimension of human creativity. That's why my doctoral degree was from a program in folklore and folk life. So the folk life encompasses the material dimension, architecture, painting, anything visual, olfactory, and so on. It encompasses all of the senses, not just the verbal and the acoustic. So some kinds of folklore are made up. For example, in America, we have something called tall tales.
Okay.
Tall tales are stories that are made up by the performer, the raconteur, but to entertain the audience. And one of the famous ones is about fishing. Every fisherman has a story about the one that got away. And it means the big fish that they were bringing in, and it was so big that it was fighting for hours, and finally it broke the fishing line and escaped. So that's a tall tale. It may never have happened, but then he uses it, and the storyteller embellishes it and makes it into a captivating narrative that then is told to an audience. Perhaps the children then repeat it to their friends, and then it starts circulating all over the place. And over time, if it remains popular, it becomes part of the lore of that particular community, maybe the family or the village or whatever, or the sports club.
Whenever we are passing on these stories from one generation to another, I feel that one of the most important tools is music itself.
Yes.
So why do people use music, and what's the power of music that makes folklore invincible, sort of? That from one generation to another, mostly the missing links are through musicians and the traditions that we pass on in the form of folk ballads, especially.
Well, I think that probably, our species, if you want to think of human development in terms of evolution, probably before we were able to speak, we were probably banging on things. And then when you start making a rhythmic banging, that becomes music. So percussion, I think, probably predates language. And it was probably a way of communicating from one band to another. And so I think, the human being's body functions according to the rhythms of nature and so on. And music is a reflection of that connection between the human being and our species and with nature. So percussion then evolves into more complicated things like stringed instruments and all kinds of other things, later keyboards and so on. So I think music probably developed alongside singing and dancing, maybe first in a ritual context, but then later for entertainment. Before there was television and radio and all of these things, what did people do at night after they came back from working in the fields or from hunting? They would tell stories about the great hunt. They would sing and dance and reenact the hunting and all of that and so on. And then probably certain kinds of genres developed for special occasions like weddings and circumcisions and other kinds of practices. So music and singing, I think, are essentially what make us human. They connect us to nature, but they also allow us to express ourselves creatively and aesthetically. And it is a form of communication. Even if you don't speak the same language, something like Qawwali, for example, it has some kind of intrinsic emotional dimension to it that is attractive to everyone, whether they understand the language or not, or the meaning of the songs.
Does it also transcend the culture boundaries between ethnicities and also between different international borders?
I think so. I think music is, a form of diplomatic soft power, and that's why people go on global tours and so on. I think that some musics don't necessarily do so well in certain cultures, but in other cultures they do very well. So I think it's a question of hit or miss. I remember the first time that that Ravi Shankar played in the West to a large audience was at Madison Square Garden in front of a bunch of young people at the Concert for Bangladesh organized by the former Beatle George Harrison. And the joke is that when he was tuning up his sitar on stage, after he finished tuning, the audience began applauding. And so Panditji said, if you enjoyed the tuning, you will really enjoy the music. So that was a kind of a misunderstanding on the part of the people. They just liked the twangy sounds of the sitar, and they thought the tuning was actually the music. But even so, I think there was some kind of, connection that the audience made with the sound, even though they didn't understand the basics of North Indian classical music, the raga.
You mentioned that folk or lok, as we call it in Urdu, is mostly associated with peasants or people from less opportunistic backgrounds. Is this also a sound of resistance?
Folklore, I think, has always been used as a method of resistance to, go against the powers that be. There's always some group that is attempting to impose their own opinions onto some other group, and the less powerful group, the subalterns, if you will, respond in kind by trying to resist through sometimes veiled ways of resistance. If you openly resist, that could lead to imprisonment or something else, or violence even, beatings. But if you do it in a way that the others don't necessarily understand what it is you're resisting, then it can secretly send out messages to other subalterns. And this is what the historian Jim Scott called weapons of the weak, and he called them hidden transcripts, because it's like a transcript for a play, but not everyone understands exactly what it means. Like when the Sufis talk about Zahir and Batin, there's the external dimension of understanding, but then there's the Batin, the inside or internal, which only those who are initiated understand. So the subaltern community are the ones who are initiated and understand the Batin meaning, in addition to the Zahir meaning.
And even in the context of Pakistani villages, if we look at different genders, women also use folk music or folk genres to express something that they won't be able to say otherwise.
That's true.
Especially in the form of wedding songs, when they throw insults at each other. They are insults sandwiched between sweet love or sugar-coated with respect for each other.
That's right.
You mentioned Sufism. You seem to have a deep interest in Sufism.
Yes, well, because I'm a professor of religion and anthropology, I call myself an anthropologist of religion. And so I've studied different kinds of religion in various countries throughout South Asia for most of my career. And most recently, I came across a very interesting guy by the name of Bawa Muhyiddin, who was a Tamil-speaking Sufi from northern Sri Lanka. But he came to the United States in 1971 and started his own, well, he called it a brotherhood, a biradari, you could say, in Philadelphia. And then later they built a mosque. And so they became a registered Sufi community within Philadelphia called the Bawa Muhyiddin Fellowship. And he's a very interesting fellow because, he brought these very strange and abstract teachings from Islam to the United States. And it was very attractive to the younger generation in the 70s because many of them were searching for some kind of deeper truth. And so Bawa himself was a kind of folk preacher, you could say. He always claimed that he never studied formally. He never went to a madrasa. He only learned from listening and watching and observing nature. And he only spoke Tamil, but he could write in Arabic, but he said that was divinely revealed to him. So he was a true folk preacher, and he wandered around. Some claim he was over 300 years old when he passed away, but he only came into the public light in 1949. And then he came to international fame when he came to Philadelphia in 1971. Then he died in 1986 and he's buried near Philadelphia. And his dargah has now become a place of ziyarah. People go there on pilgrimage, especially South Asians. Many Pakistanis go there from different parts of North America, from Canada, from everywhere. In fact, when on his 25th Urs, a film team came from Islamabad to Philadelphia and made a film about it.
So why is that we Pakistanis or even South Asians wait for Goras to sort of register our folk musicians or our folk traditions, and then it becomes a norm or a fashion or vogue where we go to do ziyarat? And even the same thing happened to the Qawwalis of Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan.
That's right.
That we waited for Peter Gabriel to discover him.
That's right.
Till he became famous back here.
It's a good question. I mean, I think part of it has to do with, if something becomes popular in the West, then the whole world pays attention. But I call that the pizza effect. Pizza wasn't something that was popular in Italy before it became a cheap fast food in the U.S. And then after it became established in the United States, it went back to Italy. And then suddenly everybody was serving pizza in restaurants in Italy for the tourists. And so then pizza became internationalized and became a global, worldwide phenomenon. And music is the same way. Music travels like all kinds of folklore from one singer to the other. And I think the big revolution was when the record came out, the LPs, and then people could start sending them all over the world, and they were played on the radio and disseminated like that. So when we talk about, Bob Dylan as a folk musician, he's not a folk musician in the true sense that he learned it orally from some guru he had or ustad, but he learned it from the records of Woody Guthrie, and then he just incorporated that style. So we can't dismiss the role that mass media has played in the dissemination of folklore. And I think because the West is sort of, the mecca of mass media, if something is accepted there, then naturally it's going to be disseminated quicker throughout the world. And then, like you say, with Qawwali, no one knew what Qawwali was before Nusrat and Peter Gabriel collaborated. And I think that Pakistanis are proud of that, that here is one of our native sons, and he's, beloved by all of these young musicians in England, and there must be something there that is, not just Pakistani, but universal. And of course, the message of Sufism is that it's a universal form of spirituality. It's not just for Muslims, but it's for everyone. So, and I think that's a message that, people who are interested in, metaphysics and just eclectic spirituality in general can relate to. And then just watching Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan on stage, such a large, enormous man, and his powerful voice was something that attracted people immediately when they saw him on stage, and then they bought his CDs, and the rest is history.
Do you think when a folk tradition or folk music especially goes transnational, it loses its essence of flavor?
That's a big argument, because some people say it becomes less authentic, or it's not real, it's fake when you take it abroad. They're selling out. So the big criticism of Dylan when he played for the first time at Royal Albert Hall, he had the band with him, literally called the band, and they played electric guitars and drums and bass, and everybody wanted to hear just Bob Dylan play solo with an acoustic guitar. But he said, that's not me, this is who I am now. And so who's to say, what's real and what's not real? If the musician wants to change his or her style, that's completely up to them. So I think that the raconteur, the performer, has the right to, make whatever kind of decisions they want. But, music is a business like anything else. And so you have managers, and you have performers, and then you have audiences. And the manager is telling the performer to give the audience what they want. The audience may want to hear, these oldies but goodies, but they don't want to hear the new stuff, and so oftentimes there's a conflict. So I think that, you know, from my perspective, I don't buy into the idea that folk culture declines with modernity. I think it changes, like I said in the lecture yesterday, and it becomes enriched by all of these new forms. And so, you know, you have now rap in Japanese rap. Even I've heard, you know, Urdu rap and so on. So, you know, it's an American form done in Black English, but as it moves around the globe, it adapts to the local ethno-linguistic context. So, and even the themes, you know, one of the themes in early rap in America was the relationship that Black people, the negative relationship that Black people had with police, because, you know, there was always a conflict there. And that may not necessarily be the issue here or in Japan or somewhere else. So I think, you know, as a genre, what defines it structurally is the meter and the rhythm and the rhyming. But then in terms of, you know, meaning, in terms of what the songs actually say and communicate, that can depend on what the local circumstances are. So folklore is very good at adapting to, you know, local context.
And in the folk narratives or folk traditions, especially festivals, we see a lot of overlap between geographic regions.
Right.
Like you mentioned in your book, Jose, Trinidad, that the tradition of Tazia in South Asia, it's very similar to what they do in Caribbean.
Yeah. Well, because there's a historical linkage. You know, it moved from Iraq to Iran, and from Iran to the Indian subcontinent, and then from here it went to the Caribbean after the abolition of slavery in 1845. So they brought with them the same drumming traditions. You know, they used the large bass drum, but the main drum is the tasa drum that they play. And the rhythms are very similar to the rhythms that were played 100 years ago in Lucknow and places like that, and in Hyderabad and all of that. I have a colleague who has studied this already, an ethnomusicologist. So, you know, I think festivals are open to absorbing new things. So in Trinidad, they call it an Indian carnival. Okay, because it's the terminology carnival is for any kind of public performance where there is music and dancing. They call it jumping up, and so that's the Afro-Trinidadian interpretation of this Indian festival, or they call it a festival, but observance, you could say. But you know, so new elements have come in, but also there are elements that are still there that were brought all the way from India back in the middle of the 19th century. So when I ask people, you know, what do you say when people criticize you for being inauthentic or doing it wrong? And they say, no, we're doing it the same way that we were taught by our forefathers. And that's the power of tradition. Tradition is what transmits from one generation to the next.
And it also keeps on absorbing information from different ethnic boundaries.
Yes.
Because folklore to me feels like a sponge that keeps on absorbing all the ethnic diversity in a certain country.
Absolutely. I think the sponge is a good metaphor for it because it just absorbs whatever it comes into contact with and reinterprets it in new kinds of ways.
Since we're talking about dissemination and passing on of information, and Virsa as an institution is also focusing on documenting and then disseminating the folk tradition safely to the new generation. How important is new generation and their relation with folklore? Because we see that new generation seems to think that it's uncool, maybe.
Yeah, I think the young generation is always a little resistant to folk culture because they think it's, as you said, uncool or corny, like we used to say when I was a kid, and not hip, not modern, you could say. So that's the old perception of folk, that it's something that the other does, right? The peasants and so on. Here you might say the backward people do it, you know, and so on. But But that's not true. I mean, everyone has folklore. You know, as we said at the beginning when we started talking about who are the folk. I mean, lawyers have folklore, physicians have folklore, and so on. So folk music, I think, is just being transformed. Most people would not consider rap to be folk music, but I do, because it was born on the streets of urban Philadelphia and New York and Los Angeles. And it's not based on any kind of written tradition. It was simple oral poetry that evolved into this genre that was complemented by studios and different kinds of, sound technology. But it really began as a form of street poetry. So it's an oral tradition. And so that is what folklore is. So I would say that, the youth are in some sense engaging with folklore without even realizing it.
Yeah.
Because they might reject the older traditions, the village traditions and all that, because it's not modern. But, so much of that has already crept into modern contemporary music. If you look at film music, filmmusic, it's already, popularized, but what's the basis of it? The basis of it, I really think, is folk tradition, like Bhangra, in the Punjabi tradition. You have Bhangra all over the place, and that's a folk kind of tradition. It's a folk music, it's a folk dance, but now you have it all over Bollywood and all over the UK and the clubs, and the kids are dancing to it. But then over there, it mixes with, reggae and all these things. There's this one artist named Apache Indian. You may have heard of him.
Yes.
The name itself is very interesting because Apache is the name of an American Indian tribe. And Indians were misnamed by Columbus because he thought he was in India, but he was in the New World. So by calling himself Apache Indian, he's saying, I'm not Indian, I'm not, South Asian, I'm not British, I'm not Jamaican, I'm a mixed up hybrid. He's everything. And his lyrics reflect that. His lyrics are really a combination of reggae and rap and hip hop, and the beat is Bhangra. So it's all this stuff mixed together.
Yeah. So how long it takes for contemporary art to turn into folk tradition?
Oh gosh, sometimes sometimes that can happen overnight, I think. Other times it takes a longer while. If someone is consciously trying to do it, like Apache Indian, then he can dictate it like an orchestra leader. He can say, okay, you play the dhol, you play the tabla, you play the guitar, you play the this or that or the other thing, and then you compose something that can be done overnight. And it's conscious. It's what we anthropologists call agentic, using human agency to make a change. On the other hand, it can happen unconsciously, but it takes longer, I think, for these forces to kind of assimilate and to create something new. So like a genre like opera, for example, started out as a folk tradition, and it became a classical tradition only after centuries of transformation. So we don't think of opera as being a folk tradition anymore, because you put on nice clothing and you pay lots of money to sit there and have the privilege of watching this show, usually in a language you don't understand, like we don't understand, like Italian or something. But in the old days, it was just done in the village square. In medieval times, it was just a folk form, and it told popular stories about some kind of tragic love affair, like Hiranja, and that's how it happens. But it takes centuries sometimes for that transformation to occur.
Okay, my final question is, it's a bit long, that in the current context in Pakistan and even all around the world, how important is folk? What's the role of folk in terms of enhancing pluralism and reducing the concept of intolerance towards each other? And another question that's also related to this is that why it's so vital for human existence to preserve heritage, especially intangible heritage.
So that's a two-part question, and let me see if I can try and answer them. It could take a long time, but let's see. I think that today, and every nation is different, but folklore, the idea of the folk and folklore is always something that's very important for younger nations when they're first starting to identify what makes us distinct as a country, okay? So Pakistan was formed in 1947, it's not that old. America even is a young nation, and we had our 200th birthday party back in 1976. So Americans are still trying to figure out who they are as well. But I think, especially in the younger nations like Pakistan, Bangladesh, and all of the post-colonial states after World War II, when all of the European powers were decolonizing, that's when you suddenly had this identity crisis, this ethnic identity crisis. Who are we? What makes us Indian? What makes us Pakistani? What makes us Nepali? What makes us Sri Lankan, etc. So all of the nations of South Asia that were part of British India had this same problem. And one of the ways of trying to identify who we are as a people is to look at the romantic idea of the folk. Okay, what are the peasants doing, and how do they live and act, and what is their relationship to the state? And so that's where song and dance and clothing and ethnic food and all of that become celebratory, become this is us, this is who we are, okay? And so the problem you have in countries of South Asia, unlike Europe in the 19th century, because there it was all the people in one nation spoke the same language, okay? But here you have this multilingual environment and polyethnic environment. In Pakistan you have Sindhi, Punjabi, et cetera, right? So you have all of these different groups with their own languages, their own dialects, their own forms of food, their own styles of clothing. And so how do you integrate it all? That's the big question I think you're asking. So I think there has to be a way of acknowledging unity and diversity, okay? And this is where the protection of tangible and intangible heritage comes in. Many of these traditions are in fact dying out. Every day a language somewhere in the world becomes extinct, because younger people lose an interest and they just stop wanting to take the time to learn something new that they find useless. So I think only when they become older do they start opining, oh why did I not listen to my grandfather when he told me to learn this language and learn the songs. So I think a lot of it has to do with education. It has a lot to do with teaching children that you shouldn't be embarrassed about these traditions, that that's what makes you who you are. And you shouldn't be embarrassed if someone says you're backward because you dress the way you do or because you speak the way you do. That's part of the heritage. That's part of celebrating diversity in unity. So I think what Lok Virsa does is really important because it acknowledges that there are differences, but at the same time you all belong to this one nation called Pakistan, and you just have to learn that difference is not necessarily a bad thing. Difference is a good thing because it shows tolerance. It shows that people can be different and still be a part of the same political and social unit. And now the world has suddenly come to realize that traditions, heritage is, on the many forms of tradition are on the verge of becoming extinct, and we need to develop methods and ways of documenting and preserving these things. So I think there are many institutions throughout the world now, like Lok Virsa, that are emerging. But Lok Virsa was very innovative because it happened even before UNESCO came up with this idea of intangible and tangible cultural heritage. So just to very briefly address the last part of your question, I think intangible heritage is the most difficult because it's intangible, okay? And it's like, the ashes of a cigarette. Once it burns, it just disappears. So the cigarette is gone. But cigarette culture is still there. how do you roll the beedi, how do you harvest the tobacco and all of that.
Yeah.
And so that's what the folklorist can contribute, is the academic folklorist is trained in doing field work so that we document these traditions. We can then put them in archives so that future generations can go there and learn and study these things and maybe revive these traditions. We've seen it in America. Many Native American languages have become extinct, but they were studied in the 18th and 19th century by linguists working for what is now the Smithsonian Institution. And so the records are there, the clay cylinders that they use for recording. And these are now being repatriated, we call it the Native American Repatriation Act, NAGPRA. So these things are being given back to these tribal communities, and they are reintroducing the study of their native languages into their schools and so on, which is a remarkable thing. Some of these languages that became extinct 50 or 60 years ago are now being used again for ritualistic purposes in those cultures. So you could say that colonialism is a bad thing because it tears people down and destroys their cultures for the benefit of whatever colonialism. But later on, I think, the spoils of colonialism can feed back in productive ways into the communities that were harmed by colonialism. So one has to acknowledge that fact and collaborate internationally, with the British Museum is the largest repository in the world for the cultures that were colonized by the British, like Pakistan and India and Bangladesh. So I think one has to get over the past and say, okay, here we are in the present. Let's get together and talk about how we can collaborate. And I think, what you're doing here at Virsa with Smithsonian and other organizations, the Norway Project, is excellent because it promotes this kind of international cross-cultural dialogue.
Okay, before you leave, what are you doing in Pakistan?
Well, I always enjoy getting out, and because I'm an anthropologist, for me, we have this slang saying, digging in the dirt. And digging in the dirt means going out and mixing with the people and learning about the culture, the sounds, the sights, the smells, and everything. So before I leave, I love the local food here. Dhaba food especially is very attractive to me, so I want to eat as much good food as I can, watch as many performances as I can, visit dargahs. I love the experience of being in the presence of Sufi peers, and so I hope I can visit some of those and just meet as many people and talk to as many people as I can, so that I can take these experiences home with me and incorporate them into my teaching as well as my everyday conversations with my friends and family.
So are you having fun in Pakistan?
Oh yes, I'm having a great time, and I enjoy being at Virsa, and I've enjoyed everyone I've met there. Everyone's been really great, and I just wish I had more time to travel more and explore, but maybe inshallah in the future I'll be able to come back.
Thank you so much for coming to our
Sure,
studios.
my pleasure. Bye.
Friends, I had a great time talking to Dr. Frank J Korom. He has written a book, Jose Trinidad, on South Asian traditions of Tazia and Muharram. And there's also a small documentary about it. We would like to play some clippings from that documentary for you, especially the parts that are about the traditions of South Asia.
Well, we just waited on the rain to stop and cut up. I don't know.
Then the big Hussein represents Hussein, the tomb of Hussein, the mausoleum. Well, the moon symbolizes how they died, the green and the red moon. Hassan was poisoned, the symbol is the green moon. Hussein was killed by the sword, red, the symbol, you know, the red.
This one must be first. Then you find the Ghulam Hussein family, who will be right after the Panchayati Hussein, on account of the amount of years that they have been building Tazias. And then you find the Kokorit Hussein, which comes third, again through seniority. And then you find the Imam Alis, who is the last one, because apparently we started after Kokorit. When the moons meet each other, they both will touch, which we call the moons kissing each other. That is two brothers meeting each other and, and kissing each other at the time. And when the moons meet the Tazias, they will have to touch the Tazias. Whenever they meet the Tazias for the first time, they have to touch the Tazias.
अहल दुनिया छोड़ दो तुम रह चैतान की है बस खुदा का रास्ता ही बासती और रास्ता है दामनी और नींद भर दे हम गरीबों की दुआ है या इलाही सुन सदा मेरी मोहम्मद मुस्तफ़ा का वास्ता.
Yeah, but I saw it in a documentary where they was like walking and they had this, it looked to me like leather, but nails with spikes, and they were just beating themselves and walking, and they walk for a long distance like us and nothing happened to them. So I was wondering what kind of celebration is that?
In Iran,
Here we go.
But before getting into this stage, there's a lot of work behind it.
So that was today's show. Folk traditions, folklore are no doubt an important part of our lives. We will keep bringing more about folk music, folk traditions, shared narratives, musicians for you. Keep watching Folk Beats every Sunday on PTV World. Goodbye.